years ago, on a visit to Ohio, I returned to Grandpa's house that stood in the heart of a fork in the road leading from Bloomingdale. On the spot where my grandparents' farmhouse was, I found only mounds of broken earth, seemingly disconnected, then filled in again to tell the tail scars of strip mining. Where once stood our old house, only scars of earth overgrown with weeds remained. I walked the property along the edge of the road and reminded myself that some memories are best laid to rest after they've been lived, remain where they have slept as a note of happier times. Conceivably, it would have been better not to have come at all. I thought it ironic that since Grandpa was the first to bring strip mining to this part of the country, that in the end, his house had been swallowed up by the monster he created. My grandfather only went as far as the 2nd grade, but he was never one to let the grass grow beneath his feet. He probably was wheeling and dealing before the school door closed behind him. From what I knew, when he was big enough to pull a cart, he carried and earned a living by peddling produce at the back doors of the wealthy homes in the area. Eventually, that's how he met my grandmother. She worked as a domestic in one of those big houses, and from the way he used to tell it, the minute Mammy opened that back door and I saw her, I never wanted anyone else. So lucky Grandpa married the beautiful Pennsylvania Dutch girl with dark hair and rosy cheeks who had stolen his heart, and whisked her, a young girl with modest wants, away to the whirlwind of his life. Grandpa went from peddling to eventually owning his own produce store and then buying up farms and selling the coal rights to the stripping companies. In time, his business dealings gave him great wealth, and he shared it with the community by building churches. He shared with his family by giving his grown sons airplanes and fancy cars, his daughters beautiful clothes, and his wife an interior decorator to furnish their house with fine furniture and velvet drapes. But as the wheel so often turns throughout the years, his business savvy finally betrayed him, and he, more or less, during the Depression, wound up where he started. And the whirlwind in which my sweet grandma was helplessly twirling finally dropped her to the ground at a time when she should have had better. 3 of her daughters with their husbands and children had returned to the nest to get their lives together after the war, including us. My grandmother was ill when we finally went to the farm. After a life with Grandpa, several early miscarriages, cooking and sewing for the 10 remaining children, living in luxury and then having it taken away at a time when she should have been able to enjoy it, her energy was spent. The poor woman, now depleted of her strength, had the responsibility of a full house back in her lap. No matter how temporary our intended stays were, as I think back on it now, I'm inclined to believe that this final burden was the end of Grandma. For the young cousins, it was paradise, playing hide and seek in the cornfields, stealing strawberries from the garden, and looking for frogs in the dank spring house underground. The big pines in the front yard that were painted around the trunks with whitewash were great hiding places when our parents were calling us to fill the buckets for drinking and bathing water from the pump outside the back kitchen door. The rest of the town up the road had the luxury of indoor plumbing, but we scrambled at night and in the morning to be first in line at the 2-seater outhouse. I always wondered why the extra seat. Who would want company in there? It was worth our while to get up with the roosters, otherwise emergencies had to be covered by the smelly chamber pots in each room. Ugh, I still remember them. Just having to lift the lid on a full pot was punishment in itself for sleeping in. Looking back, I think that the only times we weren't fighting for lazing in the hammock were the days when the thrashers were coming to cut down the fields and bale the hay. The loud thrush, thrush of the big paddle wheel behind the machine was music to our ears as it ate its way back and forth in neat rows through the fields. The harvested hay then would be shaped into square bales, bound with wire, and loaded onto wagons to take to the barn. Usually Grandpa would let us ride on the very last wagon load to be taken to the barn, and we scrambled for places to top the pungent-smelling bales, seeds, and loose pieces of hay sticking in our hair and our cuffs of our overalls. Sometimes we even dragged old Pete, Grandpa's German shepherd, aboard, slobber and all, as the tractor pulled away with all of us in tow. Naturally, being as young as I was, I never thought about why so many of us were visiting our grandpas at the same time. But as heavenly as it was for us children to have built-in playmates, it must have been far from heaven for our parents. Being there meant they had fallen on hard times after the war. Little money, no work, and nowhere else to go. But for Grandma, who had already paid her dues as a caretaker, it must have been even worse. Afflicted with angina, her arteries clogged from her fatty good cooking, she died before the last family had gotten on their feet and left the nest. She never lived to reclaim her house. My grandma died on Christmas Eve that year, and it was the worst Christmas that I have ever had in my life. Christmas morning, when I saw Grandma's overnight case that a few days earlier I'd carefully helped my mother pack to take to the hospital, I saw it hidden under the brake front near the Christmas tree. I knew she was never coming home. No one had to tell me. I knew with great sadness in my young heart. I knew. So that meant for me, by the time I was 8, I had lost 2 special people in my life. But as the circle of life rotated, it brought me something else, the love of words. I discovered my love of books and the words within them during my stay on the farm. My mother's childhood book, the only one that I've ever known her to have, Alice Through the Looking Glass. The complete work of Charles Dickens that belonged to my father and his family. They were gilt-edged, leather-bound editions. And Bible stories left by the Jehovah's Witnesses traveling the backcountry roads, spreading the word. My eyes consumed each wondrous page and took me on exciting adventures that, in my mind, became alive to me. My thoughts of the transition time we spent on the Bloomingdale farm that are cherished as part of the good times in my childhood. I can't ride through the countryside today without it bringing back a sense memory of the earthy smells of the hay and life on that farm, and when I think of what we and our parents had or didn't have at that time in our lives, we had it all. If life and our reason for being is finding our place while we're here, then our move to Steubenville, I lost my place. The clock stopped ticking for me during those years. A friend of mine, after reading the unedited first couple chapters of this memoir, said to me, "Surely you weren't as unhappy as all that. I mean, there must have been some good things that happened to you between 11 and 18. Somehow, I never thought it in your nature to be so negative." And I had to think about that. That maybe because I was so young, my recall had emphasized all the disappointments in my life during that time, and I had shut the door on all the others. Maybe my memories of that period have been, for years, so locked in place through a child's perspective, it was just convenient to leave them that way. I was slightly embarrassed at his suggestion that I might be closing off a part of my young life as it was, but, I knew he was right. Just because the bad times seemed to overshadow the good, there had to be fleetingly pleasant and important milestones somewhere within that mass of time. Although I was a good candidate for a scholarship to an Ivy League college in high school, graduating with honors at the top of my class, without parental guidance, I was more or less left to my own devices to find a school. So I thought it would be sensible to apply to the University of Maryland to get back to where I began my life, Washington, D.C. My acceptance to the University of Maryland came, and I went there. I left home that fall following graduation and said what I hoped would be my final adieu to Steubenville, my boyfriend, my childhood friends, and the dreadful dark hills of the Ohio Valley. My parents drove me to the Pittsburgh airport, and as I took to the air, I watched the images of my mother and father on the observation deck below me become smaller and smaller and then disappear as though they were dots on the landscape. I turned away from the window and settled back in my seat. I knew my life in Steubenville would be just a memory. I wouldn't be back. I had just been a stranger, passing through. Chapter 4. The Asian Flu. I arrived on campus in late August for freshman orientation, and the big bug arrived not long after me, late fall. The Oriental scourge was running rampant across the country. It hit Maryland with a vengeance and made most of us so ill that we crawled in droves to the infirmary to rid our weak and fevered bodies of this virus that was having breakfast, lunch, and dinner on our immune system. Some days within the fog of my high fever, the thought crossed my mind that if I escaped being carried out of the infirmary with a white sheet over my head, that maybe I should go home to the safety of Pennsylvania Avenue, my mother's loving care, the comfort of my dog, and the familiar streets of Steubenville. Proof that I was indeed at times a wee bit delirious, or more exactly, not yet as independent as I would like to have thought. Finally, when I was well enough to be released from the infirmary, I never thought about going home again. At least not for a long while. I remember hearing about that the Russians had launched a satellite Sputnik while I was dining on mystery meat in the dining hall. The concept of an object like that, or anything whatsoever that could circle the earth at great speeds without blowing up, or that food as disgusting as mystery meat could have been invented, was so overwhelming to all of us. Little did we know the food dilemma, as related within time frames, would pass in an eyelash as compared to that lasting impact Sputnik would have on our future and the space age we were entering. Unfortunately, at the time, our biggest challenge on campus was finding out what kind of animal we were eating when the menu rotated around to this strange tasting food stuff. I am today still at a loss to try to analyze what those years at Maryland meant to me. Looking back, there's no heavy nostalgia to get me all fuzzy when I think of my college days. Just memories of walking from the sorority house Tri Delta to class, up and down the steep hill, over and over and over again, and along the path past the white-pillared chapel to the red brick academic buildings. I'm sad to say there were no milestones I can speak of, no elevation of my social consciousness that I can brag about, or few memorable moments stored away. I did get to meet Louis Armstrong, who played at our homecoming dance, and Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, who came to visit our campus once. But I'm embarrassed to admit that truth. I did not develop intellectually or emotionally to any great extent. I failed to make the most of what could have been a turning point in my life. It was a wash, and I still was trying to find my way. At my parents' suggestion after I graduated, I went to New York and enrolled in the Catherine Gibbs School on Park Avenue and stayed at the Barbizon Hotel for Women in a room that actually was no bigger than a closet until I graduated. If this passage in my life seems very brief, in my mind it is. I wanted to leave Maryland after I graduated and go to New York to study theater, and this was the only way my parents would ever consider supporting me financially. Daddy didn't want any daughter of his to be on the stage. My cousin who lived next door to us in Steubenville, Carolyn, who was about 10 years older than I, left Steubenville after she graduated from high school. After being under contract to Harry Conover, the modeling agent, when she went to New York, she soon landed a modeling contract with Eileen and Jerry Ford of the world-famous Ford Modeling Agency. While staying at the Barbizon Hotel for Women, she befriended a struggling young actress from Philadelphia, Grace Kelly, who also was staying there. As their friendship grew, so did their respective careers. Back home, we would all buy magazines Carolyn was in and watch the commercials and live television shows in which her friend Grace had a part. And I would dream that someday I, too, could go to New York and be in the theater. So in high school, I wrote to Carolyn and asked her what I should do, and she sent me this response. Dear Sandra, thank you for your nice letter. I'm pleased you could wear the capezios that I sent home. I wasn't too sure who could wear them when I send a box of things home to Mother, because I've lost track of how grown up all of you are. I should have remembered from last summer how tall you have gotten. As far as your coming to New York to study acting, I've spoken to Grace, and she said she's willing to sponsor you at the school when she went there, the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. She said she will contact the school, and you probably will not have to audition until you arrive. With your talent and her endorsement, she thinks you might even be able to get a scholarship during your study. The school is going to send you a catalog for you to look at. Good luck, and it will be nice to have you here with us. Give my love to your parents, and say hello to everyone for me. Love, Carolyn. Now, one would have thought that with Miss Kelly's offer to provide me a strong stepping stone from which to build a future that I so wanted, that my parents would have been pleased. But when I shared this wonderful opportunity with my father, he put his foot down and refused to let me go to New York. His reasoning was that I would starve to death as an actor. The stage life was not for his daughter, and if I didn't go to college first, he couldn't help me. So that was the way my life was, and that's why I went to Catherine Gibbs. I was determined to stay in New York after graduation from Catherine Gibbs, and took an apartment on East 79th Street with two of my friends from school. I found a job working for a designer in the garment district, and my weekly salary went toward music lessons, my rent, and acting lessons. But providing for myself and doing what I enjoyed gave me new energy and focus I had not had since my campaign to leave home. In my classes, I regained confidence I had lost during my bout with rheumatic fever. Even my teachers boasted my belief in my talent with encouragement, and for the first time in years, I felt I was heading in the right direction. To save money, I'd bag my lunch, and on nice days, I'd sit in the park behind the New York Public Library, close to my office. I watched with envy as lovers, under the spell of first throes of the touchy-feely romance, kiss and whisper secrets among each other, their passions making the rest of us in the park totally invisible to them. I watched the 9-to-5ers in their white shirts and ties, tired of punching the same old clock, scan the newspaper for the next job, a way out of their humdrum. Although I made sure I got a bench far away from them, I felt not only compassion but also a certain respect for the methodic preparations by the homeless and troubled wanderers in the park. Day after day, they busied themselves by gently folding discarded newspapers as though they were clothes of fine silk which they often used for hats or blankets or just to fill their sacks for another day. All of these park people, I observed, became players in my matinee theater, and sometimes I gave them fictitious lives and stories. The skinny gray squirrels that nervously scampered about the trees, the fat pigeons, so overfed they wobbled like penguins, over here, then over there. They, along with me, were the audience for those live performances in Bryant Park. As I used to make my way uptown, well-groomed women would quickly be gliding in and out of the canopied buildings on Fifth Avenue with their tanned skins, silk scarves, and big sunglasses shielding them from the stares of nibby-nosed nobodies like me. Those big dark glasses that kept the rest of us away from their exclusive world. Big dark sunglasses that kept secrets that went on in their lives of the thin, tan-skinned women who lived in the doormen buildings on Fifth Avenue. All the way home up Madison, passing the shop windows, the tempting displays of diamonds and designer fashions made me envious of the rich, pampered, tan, and sunglassed women in Fifth Avenue. I needed a piano. In one of our one-bedroom apartments, we barely had furniture, let alone a piano, which I desperately needed to practice my singing. There was a piano living above us, which I found out its owner was the gentleman with the little fuzzy dog I often saw in the elevator. I got up my confidence up to barter with him one day. Our agreement was that I would walk his dog twice a day, once in the morning and once at night, in exchange for the use of his piano to vocalize 3 times a week. The first day of our arrangement, when I entered his apartment, my jaw dropped. The walls in his living room were lined with celebrities, larger-than-life pictures of Marlene Dietrich, Ethel Merman, and many of the other big-time celebrities that I had seen in the movies or on television. I was in awe of his weighty wall, to say the least. I was so impressed with those pictures, I figured he really must know each and every one of them personally, that even after about 3 weeks of walking his dog and vocalizing his apartment while he was away, I would slowly circle the room, looking at the pictures as though I were in a fine art gallery. Once, by mistake, I left my practice tape on his piano and didn't miss it until he knocked on our door that same night while my roommates and I were having a party. I hope you don't mind, he said, but I listened to your tape. Would you be interested in coming up to my apartment to talk to me about it? Well, a normal girl who believed in her talent would have jumped at the chance to discuss her career with someone who had such important pictures on his wall. Unfortunately, not me, not Sandra. Today, I still can't believe my reaction to his proposal. In my skewered, innocent Ohio mind, I thought, oh, a dirty old man who's trying to get me up to his apartment. And so I never went up to his apartment again, nor walked his dog, nor used his piano. In the bat of a gnat's eyelash, I lost a job, a piano, and perhaps the opportunity of a lifetime. Much later, I read about him in the newspaper. He was Ethel Merman's manager, and unfortunately for me, an important man who thought I really had talent. And I left him standing in the hallway, my door closing awkwardly in his face. How my life would have turned out had I just been a little more smarter and not so afraid of myself, I'll never know. So finally, after 2 years of studying and struggling in New York, I went back home to Steubenville for Thanksgiving and then for Christmas, and during that time at home, I fell in love with the town I so wanted to put behind me. Thus, that was the end of my New York story, at least for a little while.
Oh, none of us can wait to get to know you.